Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast. Excited for this one. We got a traditional bow hunter for you today, and we're going to be talking about hunting bucks in their relaxed zones. So it's going to be fun. Today, we got on Mr. Austin Anderson of Florida. Austin, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Doing awesome. Be a little bit better if it was a little colder down this way already.
Yeah, it's been oppressively hot here in Alabama. I can only imagine what it's been like in Florida. What part of Florida are you in, by the way?
I live right there around Vernon area, so just north of Panama City.
Okay, I got you. Jacob, how are you doing?
Doing well. It sounds hot and miserable down there. Hey, real quick before we get into the episode, also I went up to Wisconsin a few weeks ago, and we had some guys fly in from Utah that came there, and they walked out of the airport, and they're all in the same group as us, and like, man, it's so hot, we gotta come back inside. I'm like, really? I'm like, I haven't been outside. Like, what's it like, dude? It's like so hot and humid. I walk out there, it's like 82 degrees, dude. With a good breeze, and I'm like, this feels amazing. And they're like, really? I'm like, yeah, it was 94 when I left Birmingham earlier, like this morning. And yeah, they said it was 45 degrees when they flew out of Utah. So I'm like, yeah, it probably is a little warm for you boys. But talking to another deep South Southerner here, Austin, coming from again Florida. Real quick, I want to kind of highlight what we're going to be kind of talking about in this episode. How would you describe your hunting style and kind of what you do, especially when we're going to be talking about traditional archery and hunting public land. So how would you describe your hunting style, for the listeners?
I would say, practically old school is the best way to say it. I learned from my dad. He learned from some older guys that ran the Southern Sportsman Hunt Lodge up in Lowndes County. So, that's where I learned everything that I know. And that's, some of the stuff, like we'll talk about later, I get creative on, but, for the most part, I'm sticking to my roots with, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you were to describe the habitat, I know you're a big public land guy, and come to find out, I didn't realize until we started talking, I guess it was last week, that you're originally from like our area of Alabama, but what is like the habitat that you really like to hunt, like the terrain and habitat of what you guess you could say you specialize in?
Yeah, I grew up in a river bottom right there in Selma, Alabama, so I got to see what came out of river bottoms with a little bit of agriculture in them, and so that's kind of what I stick to is river bottoms and flat ground. I'll hunt hills. I have a pretty good understanding of it, but I also think that it's much harder to locate a sure enough good one, in the mountains than it is, on flat ground anyway.
Yeah, no doubt. And see, I'm the complete opposite. I'd rather hunt hill country than flatland. So this is why it's going to be an interesting episode, because this is, flatland. We get a lot of flatlanders, even people from Florida, South Alabama, Georgia, South Mississippi, that they hear us talking so much about topography, hill country, stuff like that, and reading topographical maps. Well, where you're at, that's not really a factor at all. So it's not like you're going off, those, saddles, points, ridges, and stuff that maybe we would assume, we would, again, what we would hunt maybe up in hill country. It's a lot different from where you're at. So that's something I'm really interested in getting started with you. And of course, mentioned earlier, it's hanging behind you, one of your bows, one of your recurves. So we're going to touch on that. Again, some similarities, river bottom guys hunting with archery or traditional archery equipment, guys that come to mind that has been on the podcast. Robert Carter from South Georgia, another traditional archer, has been on the podcast a long time ago. Hunts public land, flat land, swamps. That's what he loves. And then Jonathan Moreland from Arkansas. Again, same kind of habitat, really loves hunting it. And it's one of those things that there's some commonalities between a lot of these guys, which one of the commonalities is fee trees, which we're going to talk about today. But also, again, your hunting style is going to be kind of interesting to discuss because, again, you kind of describe yourself as like an old school deer hunter. If it's not broke, don't fix it, especially when it comes to like rut tactics. So, if we're looking at what, you do throughout a season, I do want to kind of take us through, from A to Z on your season. Because again, y'all open, I think it was like late October, and then y'all will go through, I think, mid-February down there in Florida.
Yeah, we'll go to it's like the second weekend in February. Public land closes out, and that last week it's muzzleloader and bow only. So that's a week that I really like to be in the woods.
Okay, perfect. So I guess if we're looking at this, well, Andrew, I'm going to segue the conversation. You got any bullet points you want to touch on before we kind of start getting into some preparation and everything?
No, I think you're going exactly where I was going to go.
Okay, cool. So you talk about you're hunting a lot of river bottoms, Austin. What if you're looking at preseason, getting ready for October, late October when all season comes in? What are you doing ahead of time in order to get yourself positioned to maybe have success on public land with a bow the first week of season killing a buck? Because you mentioned to me, you've had a lot of success killing bucks opening day, first couple days of season on public. So what are you doing to prepare for that in order to figure out exactly where and how you need to be hunting?
I'm definitely focusing a lot on feed trees that time of year. I've compiled, a whole ton of pins where, I've just dropped a pin on a swamp chestnut or a little pot of white oaks. And I've kind of learned how to use topography a little bit, subtle topography, on the map to find those. But mainly what I do is now that I wouldn't say is somebody starting out, you need to find as many as you can find, cover as much ground as you can cover, and drop as many pins as you can. And you need to do that for 3 to 5 years, and just keep doing it. Because it'll, like, I think one bullet point we may talk about is like having options. Getting creative will probably nail that into that. But yeah, it definitely helps to have options. And I'll start in September with a pair of binoculars and a phone full of pins and start checking trees. And there's spots, that I've found, 7 to 10 different trees in a decent block of woods, and I'll definitely focus on those. Because there are spots that I've over the years, found a whole lot of deer. But that's mainly what I'm doing preseason is I'm finding acorns, and I'm sitting those till mid-November, pretty religiously, and just letting the wind determine, where I go.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the habitat, and you mentioned finding subtle terrain features that hold some of these features you're talking about, which down there, I'd like for you to maybe touch on what species. You already mentioned swamp chestnut oaks, but if there's any other species that you like to target, and you can mention that in a second, but also when you say subtle terrain features, what exactly, is there something you can find on a map or something that, at least in that kind of habitat, there's a high likelihood you're going to find those species you're looking for?
Yeah. I usually look for little points. You can find little points that jut down into the swamp or little small rises in elevation between like a bunch of wet ground. And, you can usually, look on your map, find those little spots. And, I may, like, when I go into walking area, I'm going to look at that area as like a 500 to 600 acre block of woods, maybe a little bigger than that, at times, depending on, where it's at. But I'm going to look at it as a 600, 700 acre block of woods. I'm going to drop a whole bunch of pins in places, where I think I may find them at. And then, when I go to walk that block, I'm going to hit all of those spots. And I think one thing that's crazy to me is the amount of guys that like you asked earlier, the different kinds of trees. And a lot of guys, you show them a tree right there and you're like, oh, that's what that is. You're like, yeah, man, that's some pretty important stuff to know.
Yeah, especially where you're at, down there in South Florida, like identifying those, or North Florida, identifying those different feed trees. Now, where you're at, are you hunting in, is it any kind of pine country? Like, are you having a lot of cutovers down there and longleaf pine plantations?
You will definitely, a lot of times on the private, butt it up, to the public. And you'll have certain areas where there's a lot, but like I said, I try to stick, to river bottoms, and our flood zone here, is so large that, you have to go a pretty good ways off the river. But that's a good point, because a lot of times, I'll venture back in there, to those spots, that there may be a little cut over that I think the deer might lay in a little bit more when it gets cold, rather than in that shaded river bottom.
Okay. Now, in that shaded river bottom, I'm assuming that's just kind of a big woods type environment. So what is the understory like? Do you have like cane thickets? Do you
Oh
have
yeah.
other kind of like what is the cover in that river bottom?
You'll have cane thickets, a lot of privet thickets, and up north, it'll vary. Up there it's more cattails. You'll have cane, but it just looks a little bit different, I guess, than our cane down here. And but it's the one thing that we have different. A lot of privet hedge. Mixed in with the cane, and deer eat it a lot. I've seen them browse on it a lot personally, just watching them. Honeysuckle, privet, kudzu. That's just some of the stuff that grows wild. That I've seen them really key in on.
Okay. Now, remind me, I think we talked about this a little bit before we got on, but I was messing with the cameras. Are you running any kind of trail cameras or anything like that, especially in the summertime leading into the season?
I will, and I'll definitely, like I said, once I check that area, if there's a tree that I like best, that has acorns, that's where I'm gonna put it, and I'll move it around from there. But like I said earlier, I don't really like to move them around a whole. Or I don't like to have a whole bunch in an area. I like to move that one camera around, rather than have a bunch of different camera setups in an area. That's just spreading your scent, in a whole bunch of different places for no reason. Just be patient. You leave it there for 2 or 3 months, and then you can move it. Figure it. What I like to do is leave them there for a whole season, a lot of times in a spot, and just see, chart it, see what I see, on the cameras, especially if it's in a spot where I'm getting a lot of daytime activity. That's pretty much what I go for is, I'm trying to find everywhere I hunt. So I'm trying to get close to bedding, but, I'm not trying to get too close. I think that's one thing that our northern friends, kind of get kind of bagged on down here while they're here is because they're getting too close, whereas you can get that close to a deer up north, and here it's just so thick, everywhere you go, and you just can't get close to them. If you're getting within 150 yards of them, if you're using that as a game plan, to me you're pretty much saying, if I don't kill them this time, I'm going to spend the next 3 months trying to find it, which is, a lot of hard, effort put to waste, if you ask me.
Austin, you mentioned one thing, and I'm going to take Andrew's question because I'm sure he's thinking the same thing. You're talking about running trail cameras, and you really like to, for a decent amount of your cameras, let them soak for a whole season, and you're looking for those areas that you're getting a lot of daylight activity. In your area, your kind of habitat, river bottoms, is there any commonality to what those areas look like that you're having a lot of daylight activity? Like any specific, like there's certain features you're wanting to see that bucks would use during daylight activity?
Zero pressure, and not your just wore out places. Like a lot of people will go and look at a whole bunch of rubs down a ridge that run 250, 300 yards with 10,000 scrapes up under them, and they'll walk all that during turkey season or something, and they'll see 2 stands on it, 3 stands on it, and they'll think, oh, well, that's not that bad. And there's so much sign, but they don't realize that so much of that's done at night. I mean, guys, seriously, how many times have you sat in a stand and watched a deer make a scrape or rub a tree? I mean, I've seen it happen, a handful of times, but I'm not going to sit here and say I've seen a deer, rub a tree 100 times in my lifetime, So it's not something that happens a whole lot in the daytime. and I try to stick. I'm avoiding pressure. That's what I'm doing. I'm looking for deer and avoiding pressure.
Now, okay, again, kind of
Lots of tracks, lots of compiled tracks, zero pressure.
okay. So, kind of get into it. What do you typically have to see in a river bottom setting to find zero pressure? Is it an access thing? Is it a habitat thing? Is there any commonality between that?
Yeah, you definitely want to get, I like getting in a boat, and I like to have a plan. Talking about access, I like to have a plan like before. My plan is not just to, all right, I found a spot. I'm going to pull up to the closest spot on the river from that spot and walk straight in. No, I'm going to, maybe not have a great plan the first time. Sometimes I do, sometimes opening day, I cook something up and it works out. But it doesn't happen all the time, like that. A lot of times you have to sit that area for 2 or 3 sits, and then you compile a game plan, and which way you need to go in order to not spook any deer, and which way you need to go in order to have your wind blowing back to that boat the whole time.
All right. Oh, so I got to hold your feet to the fire on this. So, all right, staying on this topic, okay, about the whole, the areas that you typically are getting bucks on daylight the most are areas that are either overlooked or have the least amount of pressure. You're saying that's a commonality, okay? What kind of, other than there being a lack of pressure, presumably from access and maybe some kind of thick cover, something that's keeping somebody from wanting to get into that area, or it's just overlooked for whatever reason. Is there any other specific like aspects in a river bottom that when you're looking at on the map, is it something that you can find on a map, or is it boots on the ground when you find a spot like that to put a camera on?
So I'll look for little small like ditches, little small sloughs that I can use. The particular I use hunt stand. That's what I've always used, and there's particular features on it that break it down to where you can really see those little small ditches, little small bodies of water. And, I'll go in there, pre-season and cut them out. If I find good sign in there, I'll cut them out the whole way down it, and I'll be hunting 6 miles, of just property line that's 6 miles away from the river and no access from the road. It's almost like, your own little plantation because it's getting hunted from the private and everything's just kind of, residing on the public. So I'll cut those out. It takes a lot of work. It's not something, you just say, oh, I found this spot. I'm going to go cut it out. We've had chainsaws break, and we've had I've cut trees down on top of my boat before by myself doing it. Lost a few motors that way. So it can get expensive sometimes getting back there to the places where nobody else goes. But one thing I do is I cut them out to where only I use this really small boat width wise, kind of similar to a canoe. So I cut them out just big enough for my boat to fit through it. So your normal guy in your aluminum boat's not getting in there. I do that on purpose.
Gotcha. So I'm guessing you're dealing with a lot of down trees and stuff. You got to cut, little paths going through in order to get back in those ditches.
And man, some of these places, there's been down trees there for years, and people haven't gone in them for years. There's a lot of spots like that. I've got plans to, cut out a few more. So, but a lot of times too, I'll leave the first 2 or something, just drag my boat over them and cut it out the rest of the way. I won't cut it all the way out to the river.
Yeah, no, that's smart. But see that gives more context of like where you're finding more daylight activities, stuff like that. Which again, I'm glad to have more context for like the viewers and the listeners, just to something to think about on their home body of water.
There's an ideology to it too. I mean, there's people that hunt the river, obviously, and places with lots of sloughs in it like that, with lots of ground to where they can all. But a lot of people think, well, there's a slough every 100 yards, and going down through that, block. There ain't no deer, going cross water that often. Walking up that river, and I've seen them do it. 1,000. I've had cameras in there that you wouldn't believe that they're pretty much swimming through the crap, when the river gets high, but it's a little bit of high ground that they can use to maneuver in there. And, but, the high ground, you can't just get too locked up on it because, like, in some of those spots like that, you won't even see it on a map. You just got to kind of walk it to really be able to figure it out. But yeah, it's fun in spots like that. And then, then again, having an ideology to when that deer is going to be daylight, what time of year, you want to be close to doe bedding, late in the year. And I like to, kind of find, big acorns close to ag, in between bedding and ag, but on, as far as early season goes.
And we're going to talk about that because you told me about that that strategy hunting, hot trees, within ever how far from an ag field, and we'll talk about that in a second because I found that really interesting. That I think can apply a lot of places that guys hunting in the South or maybe in the Midwest that has ag and how to play into that. But before, just like the whole aspect of I think one thing that I think listeners and viewers can get out of this conversation, as we're 20-something minutes to the episode, is you're willing to outwork a lot of people because a lot of guys are not willing to do what you're talking about doing in order just to prep getting access into places. Again, public waterways, getting, chainsaw, cutting these down trees and everything in that drainage, that ditch to be able to get back there. But another thing you mentioned is the elevation change, between like the high ground and like the floodplain. What kind of elevation change are you typically talking about when you're talking about the stuff, if you're walking out there, what's dry maybe now into early bow season and it's going to be flooded out come maybe later in the season versus like what you're calling a ridge, like how much of elevation change are you talking about out there?
You can, there's some features that'll pick up some of it on a map, but it's real subtle. It's more like gaps in between like big cypress heads and little sloughs that run next to them. And there's just slough systems that just run everywhere, down a lot of these river bottoms. There's some up in, like you look up, north where I'm at on the Alabama River, and there's tons of them there as well. So, what I mainly try to do is, get to where, I'm walking that area and looking, where that low ground is, where all those big cypress trees are, and where the ground is, that has good, leaf cover that looks like it's been there a while. That I think's a little higher than the rest. And, some of it's pretty obvious, and a lot of the stuff that's real obvious, deer don't walk it a whole lot. That's weird. It'll be drier actually during that time of year, during later in the year in the winter, but they tend to walk that. They tend to like to walk those real subtle changes. I guess that, your normal guy with a phone and a map's not going to figure out, right off the bat. And they'll be in, ankle deep, chest deep water, but they don't really seem to mind a whole lot.
Yeah, it's like river bottom deer are built totally different. Like the guys that hunt river bottoms,
where we're at in the South, you let everything freeze over, and they freak the hell out down here because I don't think a lot of these deer like dealt with ice. I had a little 6-point come in last year and got right up next to it. Got through a little bit of the, small thin stuff at the edge and hit some of that thick stuff and just, I'm talking about hauled ass. Like he had never seen it before. So I think, like I said, during that time of the year, if it does freeze over, that's just one of those points where, I'd try to stay away from it just because, they seem to not like it as much. I kind of really get way deep in there on the good high ground then, when it all freezes over.
So,
but it doesn't happen much here. Very, very rare that we have frozen water here.
So,
well, I want to ask about real quick before we move past it. You said you look for places that have good leaf cover that looks like it's been there for a while. Are you referring to like the leaf duff on the ground? Or what is it that you're referring to there?
Yeah, so a lot of times when I walk it during the summer, early, it's been dried out a while. So there's, been that, little bit of, leaves that fall off of your spring trees. I mean, you're going to have wind blow out leaves, whether it's fall or spring, summer, whatever. And if I can find, some green leaves on the ground that haven't gotten washed away by, the water, then I can pretty much dictate that, unless it gets pretty high, there's not going to be much water on that.
Gotcha.
And there'll be other vegetation there too. I don't really know the names of all of it. I just know how to spot it, and see it. But it's just paying attention to stuff really year after year, and stuff that I've seen. I've hunted, particular places long enough, and there's 2 or 3 of them I hunt around here. But you see it, you see what that river does when it gets to a certain height, and you go into those places and you pay attention to it, and you kind of. So it's a big thing about doing it for a while. I think a lot of guys get hung up on, I'm going to listen to this podcast, and then, opening day, I'm going to kill a big deer. And, maybe you do. And I hope I hope the best for you. I hope everybody kills a big deer after listening to this. But it's more about, retaining the information and being willing to put in the time, using that information and put in the time. Because if you want to be successful year after year, you have to have options, and finding options takes time. And there's some stuff I'd like to get in on that too, but it's whenever y'all are.
No, we're gonna get to it. Listen.
Oh yeah.
Andrew told me we have a certain time allocation because of some cameras that kind of keep it under, and we may not. I don't know. Might have to swap some stuff out. But one thing I want to mention before we get off like this subject, talking like the elevation change, the cover, and all that stuff, is do you see more bucks specifically using some of the more low ground areas, maybe like on the edge of the floodplain or down where it floods at? Or do you see them using a slightly higher elevation? It might be 2 or 3 feet of elevation change, but do you see a difference there in kind of where they're moving more of the time?
Yeah, it really, man, it all boils down to hunting pressure, depending on that. Sometimes they use, if there's more pressure there, if I'm dealing with a little bit of pressure in that area, but it's on one end and I'm kind of away from it on another end, the deer kind of still tends to do what he'd do, as if he knew he was being hunted, which he does, at that point, usually if there's 2 or 3 guys in an area. Then they'll definitely use that water more, I guess, say or less, because I mean, they think like everything else, they go by what they see. And they're not going to see a whole lot of humans, swimming in the water. They're not going to see a whole lot of coyotes swimming in the water. And that's just, if they see somebody 2, 3 times in a spot, they'll avoid, at least the, more mature deer. And, the 2.5, 3.5-year-old deer I'm starting to see now, are picking up on this stuff a little better. And I actually, kind of like that. Maybe they'll live a little bit longer, more often anyway.
So we're clarifying, with areas with more pressure.
I'll tell you one thing they like to do, and some people disagree with it. You can disagree with it. if you're somebody that disagrees with it, that's fine. This is my opinion from what I've seen. And I've seen comments on other pages discussing how they don't believe in it at all. But down here, you better believe, unless it's dadgum rut, a buck, he's walking with his nose in the wind from the time he gets up out of his bed to the time he gets to wherever the first spot he's eating at. And there's certain little junction points that you can get creative on, and you can find a way to get in there and get set up in between there and where he's headed. But you just got to do your homework, and you got to figure it out. And he's not going to be there every time. You're just throwing a chip in the pot, when you go in there, and there's a chance, just like we say all the time, it's hunting. You're not going to kill him every time, but that's a big. I've just seen too many pictures that on the cams I have that show that theory to be 1,000% true. And it's just, I believe in it 1,000%. So that's kind of where I'll start. When I'm trying to figure out what a deer's doing once I'll find that I guess relaxed zone.
And we're gonna get to the relaxed zone here in a second as well. But one thing you just mentioned, and I want to clarify, you're talking about in the more high pressure situations, those deer are closer to the water or in the water, traveling with water, correct?
Right.
So
yeah.
We had a guy, one of our buddies, Shane Parker. He's got a friend that hunts some river bottom in a completely different area, and he said the same thing. He's like, he's been hunting that stuff for 25 years, like in this one area. And he's like, if you find big buck tracks or big buck sign more than 50 yards off the water, it's a pretty high pressure. Like that piece of pup gets a lot of pressure. If you find tracks and sign more than 50 yards off the water, it was not made during daylight hours. He's like, they are on the water edge. So it's interesting you saying that too. In a high pressure situation, they're on the water, bedding close to the water. They're traveling along the water in that thicker cover on the edge.
Usually they're crossing it, and they're using places where they cross it continuously, where they're crossing it from one island to the next little island, to the next little island, to the next little island. And that's what they like to do, because that way, your average Joe can't just go down through there, and they'll cross it in different places. I've seen them, do that a whole lot. They just don't do the whole lot of the same thing twice. But they will do things similar, and you just have to find, like I said, everywhere there's a junction point. There's a spot he's messing up and he's letting his guard down, and you just got to get there in that spot. Because I've seen him, walk 400 yards, and probably if you'd have been walking the trail he walked, you'd maybe seen 5 tracks, So
interesting. Also, Austin, one thing I want to get into as we're kind of working through the early season, and I know I've been taking up a lot of Andrew's time. He hasn't been able to talk in a minute now, but walk us through the situation. And not every piece of public is going to set up like this, but if a guy's setting up and he's hunting some river bottom, like stuff we've hunted in Arkansas, where you're hunting river bottoms next to a lot of ag for early season, what is your strategy there where the property line's not on the ag, might be 50 yards into the woods, or it might be around the edge of the field? What is your strategy there when it comes to like feed trees and like your thought process of morning or evening hunting those kind of areas?
Yeah. Once I locate, that feed tree that I, see that, go in there, see that has acorns, I'll make a game plan up, like you said, before the season. And, it starts out with access. A lot of times we don't have water that time of year, because it's so dry. It's early in the year. We just got out of summer. So I'll use those dried up slough beds a lot of times, and they won't be 10-foot wide. It'll almost be like little creek beds, and I'll use those as my access, because I'm literally, I don't think a deer could see me if he was standing 75, 100 yards up there anyway. They're deep cut, and I use those going in, and once I've sat that area a few times. A lot of times I'll figure out a better idea, but most of the time starting out, I'll set up off the tree. I don't set the first time I found the tree, it has acorns. The first time I set it, especially if it's close, within 200 yards of the field, I'm going to find the best trails leaving that tree. And that's where I'm going to sit at. I'm going to sit where, I think those bucks are going after they leave that tree. Because I just feel like mornings are the best. You're not running any deer out going out. You're not running any deer out if you're going in early enough. Your thermals are usually rising if you got somewhat of a cool day. So I try to stick, just to mornings that time of year, and that's pretty much it, man. I'll stay off of it and try not to run deer out of there, going in or coming out. Sometimes you got deer still feeding, under the trees at 10, 11 o'clock, and that time of year I'm definitely not sitting all day. I'm sitting till 11, 10 or 11 when it starts warming up, and then I'm getting down and I'm leaving.
All right. I got a lot that I want to go over here, but I got to kick it back real quick to the bucks using the water that you just mentioned. And you're talking about how these deer will almost island hop, or you said something, you used some interesting wording there where you said something like they'll go where they can stay in the water the most, or something along those lines. Can you go a little bit deeper on that? So what is it? So you're saying that the bucks are actively trying to stay in the water as long as possible. They're just walking through like knee deep water or something.
These spot areas I'm speaking of, like there's plenty of high ground, they're on that particular little island where they're, the flood zone sloughs surround it. And there's little sloughs and little just creek channels cut everywhere that run into bigger little lakes and sloughs. But they what they do is you think about it, if a coyote or if a human being, or even somebody turning loose dogs, is going to hunt somewhere, if they go in there and they go, well, and the first time they go in there, say they don't go in there preseason when it's all dried up. The first time they go in there, they have no clue. And every 100 yards they walk, they either have to, pull out a set of waders, and then take them off and then put them back on, and don't know how they're, supposed to get, navigate it all. They're not going to go there very much. And the deer, there's plenty of high ground in there to hunt. I think guys just get too hung up on, if I can't walk a long ways in there, I'm not going to hunt it. And, they go in there at a time of year where, it's all flooded and they can't walk very far with it, which that gets, goes back to, guys are doing too much scouting during deer season, rather than doing all the scouting they need to do during February, during turkey season, before deer season comes in. And I'll do it. The last time I walk into the woods is when I'm going in September to check those acorns, and I'm not going into the woods again until, opening day. I'm staying out of there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of goes back to your earlier point of why it's important to have options and why this is a multi-year process. Like this isn't a thing that you're going to go out and just do this year. You're able to do that because you've got years of history with this place, and you've kind of bankrolled your time, and now you kind of know where to go before the season even starts.
That's right. Yeah, I have a little bit of an idea of what's going on everywhere. But, I'd say starting out, guys starting out, just don't overlook something, because at a certain time of the year, it's hard to get into, wait for a time of the year when you can walk it, and figure out what's going on, and, have a plan come, and the plan may not be easy. You may not figure it out the first time. Like you may have a plan going in the first time and figure out real quickly that, going in that way, you're going to run every single deer in there out, and you have to let it rest for a little while, and you go back in there and you give it another shot with a different wind or, different access trail. So it's trial and error, really, mostly, for the most part. Definitely with the wind too, because I saw something somebody posted the other day about not particularly hunting the wind, but focusing on thermals. But I mean, thermals are pretty simple to understand. You know, they go up, they go down, they travel to cooler places. There's not a whole lot to them. I think guys think they sound cool, you know, and they're like, "Oh, my thermals, you know, my thermals are so good here," you know, and you know, well, great, you know, that's awesome. And I think it does. I think it does, you know, play a part into where fat deers walking the side of a mountain like they like to do in hill country a lot. You know, you definitely want to be either above him or below him on, you know, on that aspect of things, but that's not something terribly hard to figure out. You know, you sit it a few times and you see with different weather, you know, what they do. But the wind is something a lot of times that I find that's much harder to figure out. And then, but in a lot of times, you know, it'll have tendencies when it comes out of the north and in certain areas, it'll have a tendency, you know, to do a certain thing east or west wise. And when it comes out of the south, you know, it'll have a certain tendency. And then, you know, of course, you know, your cold days are always going to be northern winds, and your hot days are going to be, you know, parallel or south winds.
With the relaxed areas, you know, the areas where these bucks are wanting to spend, where they're wanting to daylight a lot, not necessarily a bedding area, but just an area that he's willing to walk around in daylight. And you also said that when he's getting up out of his bed and he's going to his first feeding spot in the afternoon or whatever the case may be, he wants the wind in his nose. And then you also
That's right.
said that they usually don't do the same thing twice. So
Yeah.
how does that all factor into your strategy? That sounds like the hardest thing ever to kill a buck in.
Especially as a traditional archer, traditional bow hunter.
Yes.
It's really tough, guys. It's not something you do every, you know, day you go out there. But like you said, I've compiled enough knowledge to be able to put myself in a pretty good situation, you know, every time I'm in the stand, you know. And there's places I'll go sit, you know, if I'm getting bored and I'm not, you know, there's places I'll sit that, you know, I have a pretty good idea that, you know, I'm either going to see that deer or I'm not going to see anything. And, you know, during, you know, early season, that's not really an issue because, you know, I'm sitting, you know, feed trees, but the little bit of time that I sit and spend in the stand in between, you know, hunting feed trees and hunting the rut, you know, there's a pretty good chance that I'm not going to see crap, you know, and I understand that, but I put myself in a good situation where I know in years past mature bucks have walked it. And, you know, I just try to, you know, stick to what, you know, like I said, don't, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just go by, you know, off what you see, as a hunter, during the time you've spent in the woods. You know, there's not no magical potion for it. It's a lot of just, you know, time and effort and, you know, remembering certain times of the year that you like. And when I mean certain times of the year, remembering that 5 days, like last year, I had a camera go off for like 2 weeks. It was like 11 or 12 days. And it was the first, and here we'll kind of have a little like pre-rut, I guess, where it gets cold and the bucks, you know, just immediately assume, you know, does are going in heat and they'll chase them around a little bit. Usually the mature bucks don't do it a whole lot, but they will at times. But they damn sure start walking, you know, and start figuring out, you know, where they want to be when it kicks off. And there was 2 weeks in January last year. It was like every day, every morning, or it was really midday. It was about 10 to 2. Every day I got a picture of a buck. And so you can bet your ass next year, you know, those 12 days or 13 days, you know, I'll more than likely, you know, be there every chance, you know, that I have a good wind to get in there. You know, I may not hunt that particular spot right there, but I'll be somewhere close.
So I want to get into your strategy on staying staying, I guess, like keeping your access really clean and not blowing out your spots. But one thing I wanted to ask about is, especially being a traditional archer, if the deer want to walk with their nose into the wind, and these spots that you're setting up in, how do you reconcile that as a traditional archer where you're having to get really close to them? Like, how are you factoring that into your setup?
Yeah, so early, it goes back, different parts of the year again, but um, I'm trying to get at that point, like I said, where they make a mistake, whether it's a big steep ridge or something drop off they don't want to go down, whether it's a little funnel in between two big pieces of cover, that is kind of hidden, and nobody's really paying attention to because it's so thick in there. They like that, I'm trying to find a little spot to where they're trying to miss a little bit of thick cut, because a big buck doesn't necessarily just like stomping through sawbriars in his eyeballs all day. I mean, he'll do it if he has to, but he really likes to have an area where he can walk and be close to thick cover, but be able to walk pretty carefree and easily, not really putting a whole lot of effort into it. So I'll try to find areas like that around maybe a waterway or small pond or something that holds water during the early season, where he kind of normally wouldn't cross that during the wetter time of the year, because it's not a very logical point to cross at. So he then avoids it during the earlier part of the season, and it's tough. And a lot of time, like I said, it goes back to getting boots on the ground and coming up with a game plan of where you think he's making that mistake at. And it may be a down tree sometimes, where he's making his mistake. He may be walking 100 yards to miss a couple of big old oak trees that fell down in a row or something. So it's just little small. Those are very hard to pick up on. It's not something you just see on a map. It's something you definitely, once you find his, like we said, relaxed zone, you really have to then just go off. Usually a buck will tend to have a few trees he likes to rub, right after he gets up out of the bed, and that's one of the best ways, to find it. And usually but around here they bed in so many different places that it'll usually be at an intersection point, which I guess would be like what the guys up north like to call a community scrape, or something like that. It's somewhere where the deer, everybody's intersecting that. Does are coming out of bed and meeting there. Bucks are coming out of bed and meeting there. And they may not necessarily all be bedding in the same spot every single day, but at some point when he gets out of his bed on the way to food, everybody's checking out. It's just like people. They communicate. They stay up on things in the woods scent wise, just like we do with our mouths and our ears. They do it with their nose. So that's kind of a topic that's really, really hard to kind of just talk about and, lay off to folks. It's something you really have to just go in the woods and see it a few times and sit there, have success, and believe in your way, how you go about reading sign. And, every guy is a little bit different,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to confirm on the deer sign thing, we were talking earlier again about you'll go on some of these more obvious spots and you'll find the rubs, you'll find the scrapes, you might find some tree stands, and you tend to ignore that kind of stuff. How does that change when you get back into the areas that you're really interested in hunting? Again, just to confirm, the difference in the sign that you're looking for, in like the open woods versus, I guess, way back in the swamp in these thicker areas or in these harder to
That's right.
access areas?
Yeah, I'll kind of like, obviously, there's going to be still sign, like you said, in the area I'm in. It's not just going to be completely bald with sign, but I'm not usually hunting right on top of any rubs or anything like that. I'm more focusing on trying to get, in between, where all those rubs are, and where I think he in the general direction I think he likes to lay. And that may change on different days. If it's 80 degrees, I'm and there's 300 acres of big saw log pines that throw off a whole bunch of shade right there on the edge of the river bottom, next to that big thick canopy. That's where I'm going to throw my chips and out of that broad area there, and I'm going to try to get somewhere in between there and where I think he's headed based off of that sign in there. But if it's cold, if it's below 40, 30 degrees, these deer down here, I don't think they really particularly like it, when it gets very cold. So I think that I've killed a bunch of big bucks coming out of clear cuts on private. Good clear cuts, ones that don't really get messed with on the private, that aren't rode through all the time, but give them a spot to get out and lay in the sun and warm up a little bit on those cold days.
Okay. Now, I'm trying to paint a picture in my head here because we're not super experienced hunting swamps and river bottoms, but we have done it over the years. Not very successfully, but we've tried. And I'm going back and thinking of some spots that we've scouted in the past and trying to draw a mental picture of kind of what you're talking about when it comes to setups. So if I'm understanding this correctly, you're looking for an area that's got hard access where no one's really hunting it. And then when it comes to bedding, you're more or less kind of paying attention to the general areas that he's going to gravitate to for bedding. You're not trying to find his bed per se. You're just trying to be like, okay, he's somewhere over here on this block. That's where he likes to go in the evenings, or some evenings he's in there. And then you're trying to find another place that he might go to and essentially put yourself on something like a feed tree in between those two areas.
That's right. Exactly. That's a great way to explain it. I'm trying to just find a general area he's laying in and get in between there and wherever I think he wants to go. Early season, that being maybe a feed tree or a big ag field, or and I tend to, as far as ag goes, our corn's usually always cut around here, so I always focus on peanuts and soybeans. And those are usually, and especially if you find one that, is still hadn't been, cultivated, last week of October, I'd damn sure be as close to that as I could be. Those are sometimes hard to find, around here in the South. As y'all know, they like to get all that stuff out of the ground a lot of times before we get to start. But, and that theory gets a little tougher, in January, because, then, you're not necessarily looking for where that buck's going to be at. You're looking for where those does are going to be, and you're trying to get on the downwind side, where, the general direction of where you think all those does are going to be, a good edge, of a bedding area. That's when you can really push, is during January, because you're really pushing the does. You're not pushing the bucks. If you're doing what you're supposed to, unless that buck's laid up with that doe, which is possible, but if you're doing what you're supposed to, you're trying to get close, on the edge of doe bedding. At that point, they're going to patrol those downwind edges, and that's where you catch them messing up, during the rut. But like you said, you're trying to get in between where he's laying, the general direction of where he's laying and where he's headed, and that can get really hard once those feeding trees give out.
Okay, that's so. Just from again practical standpoint, this is something I'm interested in getting better at. So just to dumb it down to where I can understand it, if I have a field that I know that the deer are going to at night, like for instance, They're going to this field at night, and I know that about a mile through the swamp, there's a pretty nice thicket that has got the sign, and I've jumped deer out of the edge of it, and I know they're in there during the daytime. Would it be good
That's
for
right.
me to just essentially start at the field, get a direct line to that thicket, and just kind of follow through the woods and see what I come up with as far as a feed tree or maybe some kind of pinch point
Oh
or
yeah,
whatever? Like, what's that look like for you?
definitely. I mean, you can start there, and you can start looking for a feed tree. I like to start looking for the more non-obvious stuff. Is it when it comes to cover, stuff that doesn't really show up on a map very well, but when you get in there, it's got a good canopy. It's real thick. Um, and then I like to, like Jacob was explaining earlier, you got different feed trees. You got water oaks, you got swamp chestnuts, you got, different, white oak. Obviously, a swamp chestnut's a white oak, but you got different types of white oaks, red oaks, pin oaks. Usually, when we have water oaks here, every damn water oak tree in the state of Florida has acorns on it. It seems like, to me anyway, in the general area I hunt. So it's really hard to key in on the water oaks. You can in some places, and places with more pine, cover, more pine thickets. If there's enough water there, they'll definitely key in on those water oaks a lot, being as there's not a large amount of them there, and there's not a large amount of big acorns there either. But if there's big acorns there, that's what I'm keying on. The bigger, the better, is what I go by as far as acorns go. And then you just start pushing forward, and I like to at least stay within, at least 250 to 200 yards off of that, what you would call like, what you said was practically, and like you stated, was an edge. And I like to not really push that a whole lot, and I'll move, left to right. And I'll try to, pinpoint where I want to be, of course, beforehand as much as I can on sign. But, if I see that, more of the deer movements, happening in a certain area, from a couple of sits, I'll obviously move, a little bit if I have to, but I try to not get too close, to that area that he's using, as his relaxed area. I'm staying on the edge of it.
Okay, so you're not just staying on the edge of the thicket, you're staying like way off the edge of the thicket, and you're trying to
Yeah,
just give him space because I guess the thought behind that is you've already located him, you've located him where he's comfortable, so you don't want to go up there and booger him up and kick him out and he's
that,
going to go somewhere else.
that's right. I like to give myself time. If I don't kill that deer, obviously, I have other options. I know there's other deer I can go chase on other days, but I'm not pressuring, the crap out of anything, once I find it, because I then have a very, I have a very good idea of what deer like to do in that area when they're not pressured. So say I don't kill him that year. Well, say another buck shows up next year in that same area, using that same area. Then I have a good idea, then I have an even better understanding, where I need to be at that year. So I think by sitting back and just watching the woods and paying attention to wildlife and what happens, a lot of times can teach you a whole lot about what you need to do, position wise. And, obviously with the recurve, I have to get very close. So there's a lot of fine tuning when it comes to figuring out exactly where you need to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then when it comes to access too, you mentioned wanting to hunt mornings on feed trees and how, if you get there early enough, you're not really bumping deer off of it. We have a lot of conversations with guys who hunt feed trees in early season or just throughout the season in general about morning hunting on feed trees, and it seems like that's much more of a southern thing than it is a northern thing.
Oh yeah.
How early do you find you have to get in to not bump deer off of that tree?
So, like last year, I shot a deer, pretty good deer opening day, and I was in there 2 hours before daylight. I probably had, I don't know, 8 or 10 deer walk up under me before daylight. And I had a particular deer in there that was probably 140, 145 inches. And I had one deer walk up under me before daylight and just stood right there at the bottom. And the funny thing is the group that I shot into and killed the wide deer out of, all four of them have been together in every single picture I'd ever had of them. And then come opening day, I'm sitting there and they're not together, which they had rubbed out. He was way bigger than they were. I'm sure nobody liked being around him, so that's how it worked out. But pretty sure I had him come under me just the way he acted versus all the other deer. And, you never know. It could have been another big mature deer that did it, but I'd say it was probably him. Big, wide, looked a lot like that deer, that bottom deer, but just a 10 instead of 11.
Dang, man. So you were in the tree 2 solid hours before daylight.
Oh yeah. I'll just sit up there and take a little nap. Wake up, I got me a thermos full of coffee, eat me a daggum fudge round or whatever I can find.
Heck yeah, man, you hang up there like a bat out of your saddle. That's what Jacob does.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
I use a lock on, and a lot of times I made a little back for my one that goes up against the tree too, so I'm sitting there pretty comfortable, the whole time. And I made a little footrest for my little small micro light too, so I can kind of lay back in that thing a little bit. But I always have my hand on my bow. I've had too many times where they come in there and I got it hanging behind me. I guess that's a good thing about the saddle is you always got it right there in front of you.
Yeah, definitely. That is a nice thing about it. I wanted.
I sitting down, so that's another reason why I just hold it in my hand. I try to position my stand where, I'm shooting to my left, where and that's what it doesn't work out all the time like that, but trying to pretty much, in every situation shoot sitting down. I don't like moving a whole lot once I can see them.
What were you about to say,
we're going to go further down on this deer. So the deer you killed last year, again, opening day, it was part of a buck that was in a batch group of 4 bucks. So you shot one of the brothers out of it, RIP. So looking at this, I'm interested, what was the prep before that hunt to get you in the right spot to kill that deer? Like, how did the situation arise? Were you using past year's knowledge? Was it a lot of preseason scouting, postseason scouting? Like, what put you in the right spot in order to have an opportunity like that?
So I actually went in there. I had hunted that area a little bit before, but I went in there and I walked it a little bit more extensively during the summertime before that year came about, because I drove by on the road and saw peanuts right there butted up to it, and been seeing a bunch of big deer out there in that field. And it just goes back to like spending time. If I've got 30 minutes to go ride up and down the river and check a few fields, that's what I'm gonna do, every day, if I can. But saw some good deer out there a couple different times, so immediately went in there and walked it. Ended up finding, a huge swamp chestnut, big around in my car, and ended up just so happening it had acorns, and then another one had acorns farther in. So I kind of got in between those two trees, and there was some good cover on the backside that kind of went down into the swamp, a bunch of good thick cane that, had a bunch of those sluice systems running through it. And I think definitely during that time of the year, they like to find that shade. It's hot. They're going to find that shade, and they're definitely going to be hugged up to that river than they are, when it's real wet.
Okay, interesting. And then also, so you found that, you keep talking about feed trees and kind of sitting either on a feed tree or in between some feed trees. Again, oaks, productive oaks. Are you
Mhm.
associating any kind of sign you're finding around the tree as in a spot that's likely going to hold a buck or has a buck on it? Like, are you looking for rubs, scrapes, anything around those trees?
Not really that time of year. I'm looking for deer. The more deer I see up under the tree, the more damn acorn caps I see broken on the ground, the more leaves I see turned up. That's what I'm looking for. And I'll try to look for the ones like down here. We've got a bunch of pigs, so I'll try to look for the ones that don't have a whole lot of pig sign on them. I'll try to stay away from the ones that do. So that's kind of how I determine which ones I'm gonna sit and which ones I'm not gonna sit next to.
So we had one of our buddies on a couple weeks ago, Greg Mayhair, who's from South Carolina. He hunts South Carolina, Georgia. He's another big feed tree guy, like yourself, and he deals with hogs a good bit. And he pretty much says like, if you get hogs moving to an area, like those deer just relocate, like they're not coming to that tree. Do you see that, or are they more accustomed to the pigs down there?
It depends on the area. If it's overwhelmed with them, like some places are down here, the deer pretty much have to become accustomed to them. They have no choice. I mean, I've seen a lot of times going back to where bucks like walking easy places. You'll see those little pig trails cut through the thickest imaginable, and I've seen some bucks religiously walk them, but every time they walk those, they walk with their nose in the wind, and on the days they can't do it, you don't ever get a picture of them. It's facts down here. They just normally those areas are pressured pretty heavily because of all the pigs. Everybody down here wants to kill a pig, so um, I try to stay away from pigs. But some of the places I hunt, I do interfere with them.
I want you to describe something for us. It's a term we've talked about a little bit on the podcast. You kind of did this a little bit earlier, but I want you to go in more detail. How would you describe a relax area? Like an area that, like what is a relax area to you? How do you describe it, and how's a buck's using an area like that?
Yeah, like I said earlier, the way I kind of find that area is I'll start out with a camera, one camera, and I'll start moving around in that area. And sometimes you find it on the first go around. You go in there and you do your homework and you hit the nail on the head. A lot of times you don't. You have to move it around a little bit. But once you find an area where that deer's really daylighting a whole lot around 10, 11, 1, 2, that's close to where that deer's laying at. That deer's laid right there for 3 or 4 hours. I can assure you, in Florida, in the state of Florida on public land, he has not walked around for the last 3 or 4 hours. He has laid his butt down somewhere, and he's getting up at 11, 12, 1 o'clock to stretch his legs a little bit and lay back down. That's just what he's doing. During the rut, that may change. He may walk a little bit more than he normally does. But for the most part, I'm trying to find that area where he doesn't mind moving in daylight. If you're getting nothing but nighttime pictures of a deer, then you're completely wasting your time. In my opinion. I don't, like I said, I don't overuse cameras, but I use them and they help me, a lot, by using them sparingly and making sure not to, just go in there and overkill and throw a whole bunch in there. But, I'm very, very, like I said earlier, very cautious of how I do it. I go in on days when it's raining. That's when I'll put a lot of my cameras up, a lot of my, when I'm going to look for a tree, I found where I want to be at when I'm going in to look for that tree. I'll wait for a day where it rains, and try to find the best access in. But the relaxed zone, like I said, is just an area that, he uses frequently, that he doesn't mind, moving during daylight hours, somewhere where he's laying right there, within 250, 300, 400 yards from you. And there's a very, good chance, that if he and a lot of guys, mess up, they get down at 10 or 11 o'clock, and they don't realize that, man, that 10 to 2 is a crunch time, especially in the South. They love to walk between 10 and 2 o'clock. And you're up there, you're getting sweaty, and you just, and it's not as good on the warmer days, like when it's really hot, like I said, early season, I'm getting down before, 10 or 11 o'clock right there at the mark of it. But once it starts getting cooler and once the deer start, pre-rut and all that good junk, you definitely need to be in the tree between 10 and 2 o'clock if it's cool outside, in my opinion.
Talk to me real quick about getting creative. That's something that we had talked about a little bit earlier. Having options, getting creative, and what does that mean to you, and especially as a bow hunter?
It just mainly means that I'm not necessarily, like I said earlier, going to do what everybody else is going to do. I'm not going to go look at a whole bunch of, rub down trees and scrapes and lose my mind over it and go throw a stand on it. I'm going to look, for the places where there's sign, but it's not as noticeable. Places where there's no human sign, but getting creative goes back, like cutting those sloughs out. I'm doing stuff, to where I don't think there's nobody else doing. And I don't think there's nobody else, really paying a whole lot of attention to me doing it. And I'm making sure that I don't make it obvious either. And then, like I said, once you find that relaxed zone, you then got to just really, but I think the term getting creative really means more, it's more of a trial and error thing. You do stuff, you figure out what works, and you figure out what doesn't work. There's been spots I've hunted, went in there the first time, didn't get it right, blew the deer out. He come up away. I didn't think he'd come, didn't end up killing a deer there that year, but went there the next year, came up with a plan, a better plan, and ended up killing a deer out of there. But it goes back to access, getting creative with access, getting creative with your maps, looking for places that butt up to ag, looking for places that you think based off of what you've heard might have feed trees there. It's just pretty much thinking outside the box, not going with the crowd, doing what everybody else does. I've sat a lot of places where I didn't see nothing but deer crap. There wasn't a rub, there wasn't a scrape, wasn't even a whole lot of deer tracks because the grass and the bamboo was so tall, but there was deer crap everywhere. I'd see 20, 30 deer there all the time. Sat places with 30, 40 rubs and never seen a deer. But it's just never really giving in, always, going back to the drawing board. And, if something doesn't work, writing up a new game plan and giving it a shot.
So you mentioned, by the way, Austin, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to circle back to and maybe give some examples to the viewers and listeners out there. You were talking about the value of finding these junctions. I think it's the term you use that, maybe you could find a kink in the armor of that buck, as in like how he's maybe using the wind coming in. Because you're seeing a lot of bucks using the wind to their advantage when they're moving. Could you walk us through maybe a hunt or some examples of what some of these junctions look like, where all these trails are intersecting at certain points, and how you can set up in order as a traditional bow hunter, get that deer under 30 yards, preferably probably under 20 yards for a shot?
Yeah. So, one of the particular spots comes into play. It was last year. I ended up killing a pretty good deer later in the year. He weighed over 200 pounds, one of the biggest deer I've ever shot in Florida. But it was in one of those areas, a couple different big pine ridges come down to a point all and just met. And there was like a little turkey leg system, ditch system that ran through it. And the deer just at the mouth of that ditch system just, seemed to just congregate right there, every single ridge they'd fall off down there. Well, it actually, you got to be careful. This goes back to getting creative. So I went in there and I was like, oh, this is great. I'm going to sit right here. I'm not, going to go any farther in there. I'm going to sit right on the edge of it where everything's coming together. And, it's going to be awesome. Well, the first couple times I hunted, saw tons of deer, but got blown at, 4 or 5 times every time I hunted it. So then, I think that really, is a good example of getting creative. Is at that point, obviously, it would just be insane to continue sitting there with that wind, or that particular wind or that particular situation. But it turned out where, there was just so many different deer coming from so many different directions that it was just almost impossible, to play the wind there. So what I ended up doing was I ended up, kind of going back to the map, and going back to pictures and what I'd seen and which way he was coming from every time that I'd gotten pictures of him. And, I'd pretty much determined which side of the river bottom he was coming from. If you were to explain it that way, but he was really coming from the south side of the river bottom and moving north. And I kind of backed up off the intersection, found a couple trails south of that big intersection, and got off on a couple of lighter used trails to where I could really, set myself up a whole lot better. There was a sluice system that kind of bended and dog-legged, and it was real deep water, and there was no pressure back in there, and that ditch mouth was right there, so it wasn't much for them to cross, so they were just going around it, and it was a really good point for me to get in there and position myself, to where the wind worked out, and I didn't think I would get, smelled as much, and it turns out it worked. I'd seen a bunch of does come from that way in the past, and I think, obviously, if you put 2 and 2 together, the reason he probably ended up hanging out there more later in the years because, I'd always seen does from coming from that way, and, he was always trying to lay down with them. So that's kind of a good example of getting creative, not just continuing to do the wrong thing over and over again, but, learning from an experience and, adapting, finding a new setup, something new that works for you better.
So you killed that buck on where a couple subtle trails was coming around that slough, correct?
It was more of like there was a ditch system that really didn't hold a whole bunch of water. It was just like a small creek, but that ditch system had a lot of topography on it. It was right there off the right there on the edge of the river bottom, going to where it goes up into the higher ground, leveler ground, and there was a lot more topography there, so it kind of channeled the deer to the mouth of that ditch, and there just happened to be 2 big slough heads that came together, and there was just a little piece of just subtle flat ground in between them that because I guess they were already walking down the edges of them, they weren't going to just cross right there. They were just going to run that gap, and that was a good one of those mistake points like we talked about earlier, where I could get in there. He wasn't using his nose anymore. He was thinking about where he needed to get and what he normally did every day. And he kind of lets his guard down there.
Okay. Very cool. Also, well, Andrew, do you have anything on that?
No.
Okay. So one other thing I wanted to go over with you was how does you mentioned already that you like to scout, run trail cameras, pick out trees and stuff in the rain. Okay. How
That's
does
right.
weather play any kind of factor for you when it comes to hunting? I mean, you're down in an area, y'all get some cooler weather, but compared to, if someone's listening from, from Arkansas, you're talking about like real cold weather, 30, 40 degrees, some of those dudes would laugh at that. Cause they may be hunting down in the 20s, if not even colder temps at some point in the season. But
That's right.
when it comes to like weather in an area that gets so hot, so humid and everything, Do you see any differences on like deer movement down there, or how you like to approach things based off different weather conditions?
So I pay a lot of attention to fronts and drops and rises and pressure. Is the main thing I pay attention to. Fronts with precipitation, and them without doesn't really matter. Precipitation, I think plays a big factor. I think that's an easy time that you can go, maybe push that limit on the edge when it's raining. And deers bucks love to move after rain. I think a lot of guys get mixed up. They're like, well, I don't ever see anything in the rain. My granddaddy told me, there's always big bucks moving in the rain. I think they maybe didn't listen to the whole part of the story, because in my experience, they love to move right after that rain. They love to get up, shake it off, walk around for a little bit. That usually a lot of times dictates they're moving around for that day, daylight wise. So I like to pay attention to that. I like to pay attention to the moon. I'll pay attention to that a whole lot on my cameras. It obviously shows you right there on the picture what the moon is, and a lot of times I'll log those pictures into different, what would you call it, galleries, I guess, so that I can, separate each spot from another. But I'll go over that data and, kind of put it into play during the season. But, weather, wind, fronts, and like I said, keep saying it all the time, it's old knowledge, it's stuff you learn from doing it. It's stuff you learn from people that have done it a long time. And it hasn't changed. Weather's been the same since we were alive, and there's only a few things in my mind, like I said, lunar activity, your fronts, and then your barometric pressure. And if you pay attention to those things, and figure out, which points in the pressure scale that the deer like to move better, whether in your area they like to move before or after rain better, which areas they like to move after rain, which areas they like to move when it's cold, as we talked about in the clear cuts and, shaded places. So weather always plays a factor. You just got to get creative and learn how to fit those pieces of the puzzle and all the rest of them. So weather, choosing the right option, all goes into having success, and you'll learn, over time how weather affects deer, just by paying attention to trail cameras, in my opinion.
By the way, you mentioned something I just want to get a quick take on. You talk about you pay attention to the moon. Are you paying attention to the moon phase or moon positioning, or both?
It's really just the phase, is what I pay attention to. I believe on nights, when there's less of the moon, deer tend to move a little less. And I don't know how true that is. I don't know how true that actual statement is. That's just my opinion, because I don't have any other idea of why it would link up, unless there's unless hex is a real thing, and I don't think it is. There you go. There's no electromagnetic connection between the moon and the deer, fellas. I believe in it, so I'm gonna go with the less of the moon, less brightness, darker nights. They don't like it.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Also, another thing. Well, Andrew, I haven't talked for a second. You got anything on any of those points?
Not on that specifically. I did want to bring up, tell me if this is going to derail you, but I did want to bring up annual patterns.
You're fine.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier that you like to look back on certain days. Like you mentioned, you had a 10, 11 day stretch last year where your cameras were just really on fire. Is that
right.
something that you really nailed down, is those dates where you're like, man, I had some deer coming through here on the 12th, 13th, and 14th this year. This coming season, I need to be in there on those calendar dates. Do you take it to that level, or what?
I'll try to widen my stretch a little more than like 3 or 4 days. Like if I just get a deer on camera for 3 or 4, or get a bunch of activity for 3 or 4 days, I don't really, that's not something I'm focusing on a whole lot. But if there's like a 7 or 10 day stretch where I'm getting a deer on camera there every day, I'm dang sure, logging that into my camera or my calendar for next year, sit certain spot, blah, 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 through blah, blah, blah. So I definitely pay attention to that. And, it's helped me a lot, in years past. Things tend to stay the same, unless the deer messed with.
Now, is that for any deer, or is that for maybe a specific buck, like over
I'll
and
hunt
over, or just
specific
multiple
deer.
bucks?
I'll hunt specific deer at times, but when I do, I don't hunt them religiously. I'll spend, as much time as I can in the area, wind and weather permitting. But I don't, just go overkill on it. Probably one of the deer that I really went overkill on was the deer I killed last year, and probably ended up making him a whole lot harder than what he was. But he was just a hard deer, just in general to start with. Just it was almost, I killed him. Yeah, I think I'm, somewhat decent is what I do, but that may have been one of the points in time where there was a little bit of luck involved. But it was a deer that, in my opinion, was the biggest bodied public land deer I'd ever seen in Florida on cameras, ever seen on pictures that anybody's ever posted. And so that immediately caught my attention because I'm a huge, like, big body frame deer guy. Like, I could really give a crap about what's on his head. Like, if that joker, lives in Florida and some palmetto pine swamp and grows to be over 200 pounds, I'm interested at that point. I will hunt a deer, but unless it's a situation like that, a lot of times, I don't try to get too hung up on the fact of just one deer. I'll have a couple of different groups of bucks in a couple of different areas, and I'll kind of, just move throughout those areas depending on the weather and the wind.
Now, you seem like, I mean, just based on everything you've said, you seem like you're very interested in the long game, and you're real conservative and you're real patient with how you hunt these bucks. Out of
Yeah,
curiosity,
it's not something you can, it's not something that really works on the first time with a recurve in your hand. You can kind of, you can kind of stretch it a little bit with a rifle or a compound because, if you have a really good idea, he's walking a certain stretch right up after he gets out of his bed, you can stay, far enough off of it and in the middle where you can shoot 60 yards this way, 80 yards that way, and you have, a good shot, it getting him in the first 2 or 3 times you sit it. But just the odds of him walking within 15 or 25 yards of you are just so slim. So it's really important to stick with the long game if you're a traditional guy out there and not get overly aggressive. And I get 2 or 3 opportunities a year, big deer in Florida on public land, and some years I make the best of those opportunities and I kill those 2 or 3 big deer with that recurve. But I see a bunch, and it keeps me interested. And I'm not necessarily seeing giant mature deer every time I go, but I'm seeing does, I'm seeing small bucks, I'm in the deer. So, that's what I try to do is stay in good enough areas, give myself enough to stay occupied with and not try to push too hard and stay in it for the long game.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and this might be kind of a hard question to answer, and so maybe you could go to a specific example or two about how this works out. But like, let's say you got a buck that you're interested in and he's living in a certain area. How many times might you sit on that deer before you actually end up killing that thing?
So last year I sat I think it was from, so I didn't start hunting. I got pictures of that deer that I killed at the end of the year last year. And while I was in Indiana in November, got him on a feed tree, um, right there, up close to the river. And, I then, while I was up there, I just stuck a big deer up there, and I was pretty upset about it. Really, I didn't even hunt the last 2 days. I was just tore up about it. It was 150, 160-inch deer. Had my chance, shot, arrow hit right there in his armpit. Just never jumped the string, and I just held low on a northern deer like I knew I shouldn't have. Just so used to doing it down here, but and ended up wounding the deer and didn't find him. But I got the picture that night of this deer, and I just I'm kind of one of those guys that can be hard headed. And at that point in the mood that I was in, the situation, I was like, I'm killing this damn deer this year. So I came back and, I immediately, went in, picked a day that was raining, and I walked that whole damn block of woods, every bit of it, and compiled every bit of information I had and went back to the map and, and started working towards finding a plan.
And how many times did you sit on that buck before you finally killed him?
So yeah, that's what we were talking about. That's right. I kind of got lost in it, but it had to have been from end of December to February, probably 14 times, 13 or 14 times. But like I said, I'm picking days to where, once I figured out what I needed to do, I'm picking days weather-wise that only worked, those are the only days I'm sitting there is the days that work weather-wise. I'm not sitting there on days I think there's a chance that I might go in there, and blow the whole place out.
By the way, real quick, I'm cutting Andrew off. I'm curious, it's probably not what Andrew's thinking, but did you ever have a visual observation of that buck from the stand before you actually killed him?
Yeah, so I saw him. I actually got a picture of nothing but his rack. It was the first time I like I told y'all earlier, I put the trail cameras, I like to put them on a ditch or a logging road that they're crossing somewhere where I can put them way off, the actual trail itself. And every picture I'd got of him, he walked 30 yards, from the camera, 10 yards from, 15 yards from where I was sitting. And the one day I seen him, he walked literally 5 foot from my camera, which put him at about 40, 50 yards. And I had to sit there and hold an arrow in my hand. But watched him that morning, thought I got a piece of him, or damn sure, pretty sure I heard him fight. There was actually another big deer in there that probably weight-wise weighed as much as him. Didn't have the horns he had. Was just a normal 8-point, kind of something like that right there. But he was a beast, and they locked up. I couldn't see him, but they locked up probably 70 to 100 yards from me one afternoon. So I was having quite a few, encounters with the deer. Getting clear. In my opinion, you see him 3 times in 14 sits. It's pretty doggone good odds down here, in my opinion, anyway. It's funny that you say that too, because talking about them deer locking up, the deer I shot opening day was actually, he was touching horns with another deer in that bachelor group when I shot him. So they were sparring right there at 15 yards when I let the arrow go.
Another question I have is out of those 14 sits, are you hunting the same spot every 14 times, or are you bouncing around in a small area?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I was in that junction, and I sat there 2 times and got blown out every time, and and saw a bunch of deer, and some deer didn't blow me out. But at that point I knew, that, if I was getting blown at in the first hour or two of the hunt, then my odds of killing him were very slim. So I immediately moved in to, like I said, found that, those couple of trails to where the does really seem to keep, in on that was kind of off of that junction and really stuck to those more and use that slough to kind of and ditch system to play the wind.
Okay, I got you. What'd you have?
No, that was it. I was going to change the subject.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So one thing I've been wanting to kind of hold off and talk about, but I want to get to it now, is your transition from, maybe as a younger guy rifle hunting and using a compound to making the switch to a recurve from traditional archery.
That's right.
What was that like? And then also, in addition to that, what were the hurdles and struggles from going from those weapons, which, I mean, especially like compounds, like I'm not a great shot with a compound bow, but like I know guys, we've had guys on podcasts that, they practice at over 100 yards or at 100 yards with their bow and feel very, like not necessarily going to shoot a deer that far, but, deer comes in at 65 yards in the right condition, 70 yards in the right condition. There's nothing between them, air and opportunity, and they want the air. They'll take a shot. So what's it like again, switching over to a traditional archery and then the hurdles from doing so?
Yeah. Well, first of all, obviously you gotta get a bow to start out with. I have a Sierra Blanca. Big Jim makes some good bows. Black Widow makes some good bows. There's a couple guys out west. Big Plains, I think, is one of them. There's a couple guys out west that make some real good bows. But I would suggest if you're just starting out, you've hunted with a compound or a rifle. I started out, in my opinion, what I think was a little too heavy. It worked out all in the end. But I started out right around 52 or 54 pounds, I think it was. And if I could go back, I'd say about 45. And it's not me sitting here, saying that, trying to tell you, you're not a strong person. It's more as like it's muscles in your body that you haven't trained, ever in your life because you've never shot anything with, no let off as a person, that's never shot. And a lot of people get kind of like butt hurt over it. Like, well, you don't think I can pull back 50 pounds? I'm like, no, I think you're a grown ass man. I think you can pull it back. But I don't believe that you're going to be able to have the correct form and learn how to shoot that thing properly. Starting out with that much poundage. So I would say 45 pounds. I like 400 spine carbon arrows. I'm going to try to get in. I'm starting me a little self bow, and I'm going to try to get into building some arrows out of some river cane and napping heads. But that's probably a year or two down the road. But 400 spine arrows. I use 4-inch fletchings, Simmons tree sharks, 135 grain. It's pretty much what works best for you there. And like I said, it's all in form and release. It's like throwing a baseball. You go out there, you practice it every day. Your muscles get used to it. And to be honest with you, once the transition's complete, I would almost any day of the week rather at 20 yards be holding a recurve in my hand than a compound. I know, which is crazy, but it's literally, it's like Greg Maddox throwing a baseball. If you do it every day, you look at a spot. And I use a little bit of the aiming method and a little bit of instinctive push together. But I do shoot 3 under. I don't shoot split finger. I feel like you get a much cleaner release, when you're not wrapped around there with your fingers. But as far as transitioning into the woods with it, as you guys know, anybody that's, knows anything about killing big deer with a rifle, they're going to tend to try to stay as far off, whatever area that deer's using as possible, as the cover, or even if they have to find an area that he's crossing that they can see a long ways, they're trying to set up on that area, get in the stand, if they're, say 200, 300 yards away from, where they're wanting to kill that deer at, then, there's no chance of them running that deer out before daylight. They're not getting anywhere close. But you kind of have to throw all that out the window. And you have to, like I said earlier, you got to get creative, find those little bitty mistakes he's making and key in on those mistakes and use them to your advantage. Because
Awesome.
it's really huge, you know. It's you like we talked about. I think the other day, me and you were talking about it. You know, getting 15 yards, you know, from where you're wanting to be, and getting 60 yards is a whole different ball game, just scent wise, in my opinion. Time after time going in there, so you definitely have to be patient. You can't overhunt a spot with a recurve because of how close you're getting. And I think same thing goes with a compound. I mean, you're still getting, you know, right there close to them. It's just the margins kind of lowered even a little bit shorter. But definitely, you know, something that if I was hunting with a rifle, I'd probably pick up a compound first and shoot it for a year or two, get used to killing deer with a compound, and then maybe make that switch once you feel comfortable with a compound. But compound guys, I really urge compound guys to pick it up and try it, man. Maybe it doesn't work out for you. Maybe it does. Buy a small, inexpensive, well-built bow. Bear makes a whole bunch of them. You can play around with them in the backyard. If you got it, you got it. If you stick with it long enough and you practice, you know, I don't think it really matters, you know, who you are. I think you can make it work. But man, when you send that first one through it, and you walk up with nothing but a piece of wood in your hand and a little carbon stick with some metal on the end of it, feels pretty doggone good.
That's awesome.
Yeah, no, that's killer, dude. Well, sweet. Well, Austin, I think that's a great point of us wrapping up for tonight. So, or on this episode.
I appreciate you guys having me, man. I had a blast.
Absolutely.
Hope everybody
Well,
enjoyed it.
Yeah, hopefully we get some listeners to write in, you know, some things that they liked about the episode, and also maybe certain aspects of what you do that maybe they want to try and go out and apply. Because the biggest thing about this podcast that gets us excited to keep doing it after 600, this is like 602, the 602nd episode.
Yeah, 602.
Is listeners actually implementing what some of these guests like yourself talk about and actually go out there and have success killing bucks by stuff they learn on the podcast, and really helping people shorten their learning curve. So I'll be interested in seeing, you know, based off our conversation today, you know, different points that people have. Maybe they write in like, hey, I'm going to try this based off what Austin said. You know, I hunt a similar area, whether it's in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, wherever, and see about implementing some of the stuff you've talked about and trying to have some success doing so.
That's right. Yeah, man. I definitely hope some guys learn some stuff. Sometimes I'm not the best at explaining things. I'm not an English scholar, but I try to break it down the best I can, and you know, whatever. Like it's not going to always be, you know, everything I say is right. You know, it's whatever works best for you, where you're at, based off the sign, you know, you're looking at, and like I said, you know, it always goes back to we hit on a bunch, getting creative and having options. So hopefully some people can kind of use those topics and kind of brainstorm a little bit on them and have some success this fall.
Absolutely. Well, Austin, appreciate you joining us on this episode. Listeners, thank y'all for listening to this episode again. And then also the YouTube viewers, appreciate y'all watching this podcast again. Everybody share the episode if you've enjoyed it. Let us know again what you like from the episode. Of course, you can leave us a 5-star written review. And other than that, we'll catch y'all back here in the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman podcast. And remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.